Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy.
This is episode number 164. She's frustrated. He's frustrated sexually. Yes, we are going to talk about sexual frustration today. Now, this is such an interesting topic because usually when you hear about someone being sexually frustrated, it's usually the husband, right? This is the story that we hear a lot and that we're surrounded by, is that the husbands get sexually frustrated. Now, usually they get frustrated with the frequency of sex, right? Maybe they wanted it to be higher in their marriage and it's not turning out that way. And maybe he was hoping that her desire for sex would be just as high as his, that they would be matched exactly. And now that they're married, he's realizing, wait a minute, our desires are not the same. And this is really frustrating. And it could also make them think certain negative things about their spouse. Like maybe she's not the right one. If her desire isn't as high for me as mine is for her, maybe something has gone wrong. Also, he could be frustrated because she is not enjoying the sex as much as he is. And he probably is somewhat aware of this and is wishing that she was enjoying it the same way he was, because then maybe if she was, then maybe her desire for it would be higher, more like his. That's often the story that we hear and understand with the husbands. But we don't usually hear about the women being sexually frustrated. And the sad thing is that women are sexually frustrated. The wives are sexually frustrated, but they're for different reasons than their husband. Usually, when a wife is sexually frustrated, it's because sex is not what she thought it was going to be. A woman grows up with rom-com movies and a lot of ideas about romance. And so we look at sex as the culmination, the cherry on top of all these romantic experiences with our husband. And those often take place while we're dating. But then in marriage, we're like, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was. And I thought I would feel so different about sex when I was having it. But now that I'm having it, I am not feeling like I thought I was going to feel. I don't feel like very loving. I don't feel like it's the cherry on top that comes at the end of being super close and connected. In fact, what I'm finding is that I'm often feeling quite negative while I'm having sex with the man that I love. So there are very conflicting feelings during the experience of sex. Now, when this takes place, it makes orgasm much more challenging. Much more challenging. Stress is a huge blocker to feeling that desire and being able to allow our bodies to go into the phase of arousal. And so when we recognize our negative thoughts, then we add stress on top of that. Like, this isn't supposed to be happening. I thought things were going to be so different. So then if she's not having an orgasm, she's not having pleasure, she's not tapping into that part of the brain that gets activated from having an orgasm, feeling pleasure, and then the brain saying, oh yeah, that was a good experience. Go back for more of that. That is often not taking place. And then she ends up feeling very confused, very unsatisfied, little to no pleasure. And she often ends up thinking something is missing. And she would be right. Something is missing. Now, what is going to be really important in this podcast is to know that there are a few things missing. One is correct knowledge. And this is going to be that correct knowledge is needed about the female arousal system, because what a woman needs to be aroused is not the same as what a man needs to be aroused. So if men experience spontaneous arousal, that can happen anytime from anything. They can be aroused with little to zero effort. And we know this because even baby boys can have an erect penis, right? And that's before they even understand what sex is. So their arousal is very easy, very easy. They don't really need to put any effort into it. Now, a female arousal system is completely different. She has receptive and responsive arousal, which means there are other components that need to come into play in order for her arousal to be activated. Now, we aren't taught this, right? We're not taught this. And so therefore, this kind of knowledge is missing for both the wife about herself, and the husband hasn't been taught this about his wife. So we have two different systems that are at play, and we kind of don't even realize that. We are not taught this. So what I want to point out here, something else that has been missing, is this female arousal system. In my course, we call this the intimacy trek. Now, the awesome thing about this is the intimacy trek includes the husband's arousal system. So when we really spend more time using the female-driven intimacy trek, the men are not left out. Quite the opposite. They are totally included. But if we only focus on a husband's desire and arousal, the women will be left out. They will be excluded. And so we really need to make sure that we know this information and we start to make that shift of using the entire intimacy trek, which is all inclusive. Okay, we need to start operating from an all inclusive system, which is the intimacy trek and not an excluding one. Okay, now the other thing that is missing are correct skills, right? First, we were missing knowledge, but now we're missing skills of what to do about this knowledge about the female arousal system and how to help improve it. Okay. Now, this is not a skill that is taught out in the world. This is why people come to me for life coaching skills. We need to use skills that are effective for the woman, because they will be effective for the man. If we try and only do skills that are effective for the man, the woman will still be excluded. And so we really need to make sure that we have a great understanding of this concept. So I just wanted to share a story about a couple that I've worked with recently, and I'm not going to use their real names. So we're just going to call them Dave and Emily. Now, Dave's frustration went something like this. Man, I wish that sex could just be more fun and easy. I wish that Emily just liked it and wanted it as much as I do. Now, Emily has something very similar. Her frustration is, man, this is tough. I wish sex was more fun and easier. I wish that my sex drive was a little bit more like Dave's. Why can't it be? So it's very interesting that Dave and Emily, they're both frustrated with their sex life, and their frustrations are actually quite similar. Emily wishes her sex drive was as easy as her husband's. She wishes that her desire was higher like his, and that she didn't have to think about things so much. She wished she enjoyed it more, and that it was more of a fun and romantic experience, like that cherry on top. So they're both very frustrated. And it's because they're missing the correct knowledge about the female arousal system and the components. Husbands don't have components to their arousal. Since their arousal is spontaneous, it can just happen at any moment for any given reason. The female arousal system actually has precursor components. And if we don't know what they are, yes, there's going to be a lot of frustration that is experienced. Now, before we move into what we need to do about this, I want to point out a few numbers because this is so important. And I bet if I were to ask you, tell me the numbers about the testosterone levels in males versus females, I bet most of us couldn't do that, right? That's not something that we're taught a lot, and it's probably not numbers that stick out in our mind. But it's so valuable if we know these numbers, because then we can stop looking at our spouse as if there's something wrong with them, right? Husbands can stop looking at their wives saying like, man, your desire isn't as high as mine. Like, you're just a prude. Something's wrong with you. I want a different model. But on the same token, a wife sometimes looks at her husband and she's like, all he thinks about is sex. That's all he wants. That's all he cares about. He just wants it all the time. He's such an animal. Like, get a grip on it already. And we start to horribilize our husband for their sex drive. So let's look at these numbers really quick and allow it to give us some real knowledge and real perspective. And then it will allow us to have some compassion for ourselves and for our spouse. Okay, so we know that testosterone is not the only hormone at play, but this is the one that is very common, most talked about. And so it's important for us to just have a baseline understanding of these numbers. Men's testosterone levels are usually in the range between 800 and 1,200 nanograms per deciliter. Okay, think about that. The lowest number of that range for men is 800 to 1,200. Okay, now for the women, their testosterone numbers are anywhere from 9 to 70. Our highest number, the highest number for women, is not even close to the lowest number for men. This is a huge difference in numbers. And it's something that we're usually not aware of. This fact alone can cause so much frustration. It's really interesting how many women will come to me when they feel like their desire for intimacy is low and it doesn't compare to their husband's. And their first thought is like, something's wrong with me. My hormones are off. Actually, they're not. They're right on target. You're not supposed to match your husband biologically. These numbers are not meant to be the same. Women can't go into their brain and go, all right, testosterone, today I want you to be at a higher number. Let's match my husband today. Oh, can you take it up to 900? We can't do that. This is how our body is functioning. It's functioning on these levels. So when our desire is lower than our husband's, yeah, that's right. That is correct. That is normal. Men's testosterone levels are 15 times higher than a woman's. Think about that. Has that been a big cause of frustration? Yes. So if we take a look at this by the numbers, men have high numbers, high levels of testosterone. Even with no effort on their part, those numbers are high. Their desire is high with little to no effort. They don't have to think about their arousal. It happens. They're biologically wired to happen. They're biologically wired to function that way. Now, women are on the opposite side. Their numbers of testosterone are low. So desire is a challenge for them. Those numbers are not on her side at all. So this means she has to put in a lot of effort to activate her desire for intimacy, her desire for sex. It's not easy biologically. On a fundamental level, desire is not easy for her. The numbers are not on her side. And so while a husband has little to no thought about his arousal system, the woman has got to have a lot of thoughts about it, right? And so far, they're probably not positive. They're probably quite negative. So we can see that there is this big gap here that needs to be addressed. And most of us out there have not been taught how to address this gap. So I want to just spend a minute to talk about frustration, right? I love to define words and we just haven't done it yet, but let's define frustration. Frustration is the feeling of being upset or annoyed, especially because of inability to change or achieve something. So I want to just pause right there because part of our frustration as a spouse is that we're annoyed. We want our spouse's testosterone levels to be different. We want those numbers to change. We want them to match our own so that life is easier. That's really what we want. We want things to be easy. And we knew if those numbers were more the same, then it would be easier. Everything would be easier about all of sex, right? But the fact is that those numbers are not, and they are not meant to be the same. So there is going to be some frustration because we cannot change the biology of our spouse. We cannot change that. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes we can take hormones, but man, again, think back on those numbers. They're not meant to be the same. So we're going to need to dig a little deeper. Now, another definition of frustration is a circumstance that causes discouragement or anger. Now, for all of you that are even slightly familiar with life coaching and the self-coaching model, I wonder if this definition started like flashing a neon sign to you, right? Because it's defining frustration as a circumstance, right? That means the situations we face that causes discouragement and anger. Okay, for women, for mothers, this is happening on a daily basis with situations that have nothing to do with sex. And then on top of it, you add the situations and the circumstances that do have to do with sex. Our circumstances are a huge component to our arousal system, to the female arousal system. So taking a very close look at a woman's circumstances, a wife's circumstances, are going to be key as a building block to building desire and moving into arousal for sex. If we start paying attention to the circumstances that are causing discouragement and anger in our lives, and start addressing them, we will be able to start lowering frustration and start moving towards fulfillment, even sexually. But not only sexually, but more as a whole picture, the completeness, the wholeness. And that is going to start to feel very amazing. The third definition of frustration is the prevention of progress, success, or fulfillment of something, right? So when we feel like we're not progressing, even as a person, as a mom, as a wife, in our own lives, our own pursuits, or even in the sexual experience, when we feel like there's no progress, no success, that is frustrating. And the final definition of frustration is a state of insecurity and dissatisfaction arising from unresolved problems. Man, think about this. Unresolved problems. If you have multiple children, there are always situations that are coming up, right? Unresolved problems. When we have the never-ending to-do list, that's unresolved problems. It's like there's always constant things in our mind and going on. And if we are not resolving these problems, that can add to the frustration that we're feeling. If there are problems in our sexual experience with our spouse, that is going to add to the frustration we feel about sex. And it's going to make it harder to enjoy sex and then get to the pleasure of it. So again, if you take all those definitions, the most valuable would be to look at the concept of the circumstances, right? And now this is going to go for both the husband and the wife. Look at the circumstances that are causing you to be annoyed and upset. If you have been a husband who is frustrated by the frequency, I want you to take a close look at the circumstances of the testosterone numbers, just the reality of that. And that type of information alone can start to really lower your frustration as you say, okay, that's not the thing I need to change. I can't change those numbers. But there are things we can change. But there are things we can change about a woman's circumstances. Okay, well, let's work on that because we can totally work on making some changes in that area. So I wanted to point out that under the right circumstances, right? Sex is good. Sex is good for marriage. Sex is good for the wife. It's good for the husband. It's good physically, it's good mentally, and it's good emotionally. But under the wrong circumstances, sex can be bad for marriage. So that would be, for example, if a wife is having sex out of duty and obligation, and she doesn't like that reason, but she's just doing it like, oh, it's been a few days, my husband's getting grumpy, and she's having it for that reason under those circumstances, then the arousal system has not been activated. She's not enjoying it. Sex is not enjoyable for her, and it's very hard to connect with the pleasurable part of the brain. So we need to pay close attention to the circumstances that are happening and how we're approaching those circumstances. Are we taking action to resolve some of the problems that we are encountering? It would be very beneficial as we think about how to approach this moving forward, that each of us, each spouse will need to take a closer look at the specific circumstances that are annoying to them personally and discouraging them on a personal level, right? So you're not going to go and tell your spouse what to do different, right? That we're not going to do that. We don't go about trying to change our spouse. That's very frustrating and unfulfilling because adults don't like to be told by other adults what to do, even in marriage. So this is going to be what each of us do for ourselves. We each need to take a personal look at the specific circumstances that are bugging us, making us frustrated, right? We, on our own, will need to start to try to resolve some of those unresolved problems. Let's look at the root of some of those problems and work on our own solutions to try to improve those things. And make sure that we're not, again, looking to our spouse to do all the problem solving. We can ask for an idea here and there, but we should not be reliant on our spouse to be trying to resolve some of the problems and put all the weight on them to do it. And we will need to make sure that we are thinking, we are the ones. I am the one that needs to make a change in order for progress to be made. I need to look within myself first. That's the first place. It's the starting point. So we need to make our own changes so that we can feel better about being an active participant in resolving some of the challenges that we're facing, whether it's directly connected to sex or it's just other unresolved issues that have been hanging over our head and we just haven't approached it. When we have all that baggage and we just keep carrying it around, it just gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and we find it harder to find fulfillment in the other areas of our lives. So as we start resolving some of these overhanging challenges, we will start to feel more relieved, and we will have opened up more space, even mentally, to approach the sex topic in our marriage. So what we need to do, and what I would like to challenge each of you to do, is something very specific this week. And I want you to make a promise to yourself. Okay? So starting right now, I want you to promise to yourself that you will be the one to approach your own sexual frustration by taking a closer look at the specific circumstances that cause your sexual frustrations on a weekly basis. Okay, so this is something to be very active and involved in. Every week, ask yourself, what specific circumstances are causing me frustration? Increase your awareness of them. That's an amazing first step to increase your awareness. Okay, now promise this to yourself this week. I will finally face the unresolved problems that are preventing progress from being made. So if you're struggling sexually and there are some challenges there, it's time to face them this week and say, I am going to start to face this head on, and I'm going to do something about it so that I can feel empowered and so that I can see some progress, even if it's just 1 or 2 steps. And finally, promise this to yourself this week, that I will be the catalyst of change and not wait around for my spouse. When you decide that you're going to be the catalyst of the change in your own life, that feels so different than waiting around for somebody else to be the change of and the catalyst of change in your life, because they may never do it, right? But when you are able to change, you're often an inspiration to your spouse to do some changing as well. So the key point here is each spouse's sexual frustrations are their own to resolve. But as you start to do that, as you start to approach them yourself, frustrations will go down and fulfillment will start to go up. And that's a much more fun place to live life and to experience your marriage. Now, before we end this episode, I want to tell you guys about my free webinar that is coming up very soon at the end of September. And again, it's totally free, but you do have to register. So it's going to be Friday, September 29th at 11 o'clock a.m. Mountain Standard Time. So make sure you do the time adjustments for whatever time zone you're in. And this webinar is going to be called From Sexual Frustration to Sexual Fulfillment. So today you got just a little drop, a little hint of what this webinar is going to talk about. It's going to talk about the reality of sexual frustration, not just for the husband, but for the wife as well. Now, I want to encourage every wife, every woman that's listening to this, to get your husband on board to this webinar. Because if you're feeling frustrated sexually, like you know something has been missing, often the emotional component, we're going to talk about that in this webinar. we are totally going to address it. And it's going to be so valuable for the husbands to be there and to listen, because it's not the only thing we're going to talk about, but it's going to really address his sexual frustrations in a way that he's like, okay, yeah, she gets what it means to be sexually frustrated as a husband. And I want to really empower each spouse to take part in this webinar, because it really is for both. And part of the Anderson coaching mission is to really have a safe space and a platform that is all inclusive of the female experience. So a lot of the vocabulary that we use and the way that we word things is often to make sure that women aren't tuning out to the message and to the knowledge and information that we present. And at the same time, we want to make sure that the husbands understand that this is also just as much for them, because they are also frustrated in their own ways. And so it really is a format that is all inclusive. It's made for husbands and it's made for wives. The biggest difference is that most of the information out there has been mainly studied and presented from a male perspective, which leaves the female experience and perspective out of the picture. And so even the most noble husbands and the most noble wives can be struggling in this area of their sex life. And even if they are trying really hard to improve it, they're just missing the correct information. So please go to my website, shelly.andersoncoaching.com. And right on the front page, the home page, you're going to see a place where you can sign up. You need to register for this webinar so we can have a final count and know exactly who's attending. So please make sure you go there, send your husband there, send your wife there. We need to really make sure that we are strengthening our marriages across the globe and that we have the correct tools and skills and knowledge so that we can pass them down to our own children and the next generation after that. I think we all know that the rising generation is lacking in a lot of skills, especially communication skills. And so if we're not learning these things ourselves, how are we going to pass them down to our kids and our grandkids? So please make sure you sign up for this webinar. It's going to be awesome. And just as a little hint, we're going to talk about 4 sexual systems. We kind of hit on one of them today. We're going to talk about the 3 traps that keep couples sexually frustrated. We're going to talk about 2 sex expectations and the 1 skill that changes it all. So go to my website, shelly.andersoncoaching.com, and sign up for this free webinar. I hope to see you all on September 29th at 11 o'clock a.m. But remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will join me again next week.